When we decide to take a look at barriers to listening, one of the things we need to realize is that we have certain barriers, and how we overcome those barriers partially depends on what kind of barrier that it is. Now, the exercise you just did, where you had to remember the story that was said to you, that story was a bit unfair, and you probably felt that way. Part of the reason is because it was used to highlight many of the barriers that we encounter with listening. Overall, there are four main types of barriers, and you end up tackling these barriers in different ways. So, moving on to the first barrier. The very first barrier are called physical barriers. Okay. And what these things do is they usually prevent you from hearing or seeing. That is one of the main things. They are physically there, preventing your physical senses, because that can make it hard to listen, no matter what. This could include loud music that is playing and it's just drowning out the person you're trying to listen to. These, because of the fact that it's there, whether it's music, some idiot with a leaf blower at 5 a.m., they're easy to discover, but not always easy to counter. You can always leave the location where the loud music is or turn it down, turn off the TV so it's not a physical barrier there. Good luck getting that guy with a leaf blower and a lawnmower at 5 a.m. to not be out there at 5 a.m. Sometimes you can't do much about them, but even if you know they're there, then it can still help a little bit realizing that that barrier is there. Moving on to the second type of barrier, we refer to them as personal problems. And we don't mean like, oh, that girl's got personal problems. It's not that kind of thing. These are problems that exist within the listener. They make it hard to concentrate because the listener has some issue that is making it tough to concentrate. There can be lots of things. It could be being hungry. If you're hungry, you're thinking about your tummy rumbling and you're now not listening as well. You could be worried about the test. You could just be tired. Lack of sleep makes it tough to listen. And when it's tough to concentrate because things are happening either physiologically to you in the case of hunger or being tired, or mentally if you're worried about a test, or if you just had a fight with your significant other, all those things can make it a lot tougher to concentrate. That means you're not going to pay as much attention. It also makes it harder to understand. If something is very thick information, it takes concentration to understand it and think about it. And it definitely also hurts you on the step of remembering, because your memory is not fully concentrating on remembering what you're hearing. It's also concentrating on remembering those test questions you think you're going to have for the exam. The simple fact is, this has to be overcome by the listener. No one can eat for you. I wish people could take a cat nap for me. I'm a parent. I would pay money for people to sleep for me, because with a 5-year-old who's energetic, I never get enough sleep. But I can't. I have to find a way for me to sleep for myself. And frankly, that test that you're worrying about, well, you're the one who needs to study for it. So keeping that in mind, once you identify a personal problem you have, one, you can set about trying to solve it, whether it's get a cup of coffee because you're tired, or you can also, just knowing that it's there means when it's popping up and making it harder for you to concentrate, you can consciously go, ah, there it is again, got to buckle down and concentrate more. Moving on to the third barrier, and that is cultural differences. Now, the thing with cultural differences is, the more different two people are culturally, the harder it is to communicate. And this isn't necessarily a you are or you aren't the same culture. It's really more of a spectrum. The fact is, very few people are from the exact same culture. Me and my brother, I guess, were when we were young, but then as we became adults, we started having other cultural influences between us. My brother has lived in Michigan and Cincinnati two Midwestern towns. I've never lived in the Midwest. I've visited, nice place, don't really want to live there. And so keep in mind that these cultural differences can drive a wedge between two people communicating. And while it doesn't have to be huge, age is a cultural difference. All right. Most of you, as my students, probably never have operated a VCR before. Meanwhile, uh, I have. I did a lot of stuff with VCRs when I was young because DVRs didn't exist, and it was the only way we record TV shows. And then if you go back even older, my mother-in-law has probably never touched a VCR in her life. So those are and that's just age. When you throw in other things, the barriers can be much bigger. If I'm trying to talk to someone who's a K-pop fan in South Korea, wow, that's a huge cultural difference. I don't speak Korean. I don't know anything about K-pop other than it's really colorful, really poppy, and they have lots of hip dance moves. I don't really like K-pop. I don't even know what we'd have in common to talk about. That is a huge cultural difference. Whenever there is this difference, what happens is both sides, both the listener and the speaker, need to try to bridge that gap. They both need to work at it because it's not that one person's culture is wrong or you're so different. The problem is the difference between both people's culture. This was illustrated very much in the exercise you did by the names of the characters. You probably had some trouble remembering the names of the characters. And it probably would have been easier if they were more common names based on your culture. This culture it's based on is feudal Japan, which not only is it another country for probably most of you, but it's a completely different era as well, where the way people act and the way people are likely to communicate, and definitely the names that they're going to have. The story didn't just highlight cultural differences. It also highlighted the very last barrier, which is a lack of context. If you had some problems with it, don't worry. It takes place in the fictional world of Rokugan, and if you haven't heard of it, you're not alone. I've only had 3 students ever who were familiar with Rokugan before this story was read to them. And there's a lot of things to know. You need to know that they have different clans, and each clan's named after an animal. And so when they say there's a crane there, that crane is really just Diodoji Yuji, who's a member of the Crane clan. There's not an actual bird hanging out on this person's shoulder. So what happens is the audience might not know enough to understand the speech. They might not have enough context, and you have to worry about that. You have to make sure your speech is written for the knowledge base of your audience. If you were to give a speech on COVID-19 to a bunch of doctors, you would probably do it very differently than if you were going to give it to a bunch of college students. Doctors know what viruses are. They know how they reproduce. Explaining to them about the little hook pick that the virus has, which connects to receptors that allow the virus RNA to get into the cell. Those things are like, yeah, we know viruses do that. And if your doctor doesn't know that about viruses, you probably need a new doctor. Meanwhile, I would never expect my college students taking my Com 10 class to know how viruses reproduce. I wouldn't even expect that in a biology class. I'd probably expect to teach it to them in that biology class, not necessarily that they already knew it. And so keep that in mind. Whenever you're the speaker, you need to give enough context so the audience can understand, and you have to adapt to what your audience knows. It's your job to do that, to consider what does my audience already know, what can I assume that they know, and how should I frame things so that I can increase their understanding. By having a knowledge of these 4 barriers, it makes it a lot easier to overcome many of the difficulties in listening.